to give them a chance to introduce themselves. What we're going to do is each side will get an opening statement. We're going to try to keep it not too long. And then we have 3 topics that we're going to discuss. The Florida Amendment 4, Medicaid expansion, and I almost forgot, no, I have to get that one, net neutrality. We're going to have each side speak to it. We'll have a couple of questions we'll whittle in. We're going to have about 15 minutes for each segment, so it's going to be pretty tight. Toward the end of that, what we're going to do is not run the full 15 minutes. We'll stop at the end of that topic and ask them to try to come to some kind of consensus, some kind of, based on what you've heard each other say, what common ground do you think y'all can find between you, and have them share that with us, and then we'll move on to the next thing. If you have any questions that you want to ask, that you want us to ask for the 4th segment, you can tweet them with the hashtag DebateBay, and we've got people monitoring that. They'll get the question up here. If you're old-fashioned, Alvin, if you want to just write it down and walk Love Alvin. We'll do that and we'll take care of you. We're going to have to speak loud because we do not have a sound system. We didn't want one. Talk to Daniel, the owner. By the way, if we could have a quick round for Daniel. He really pulled this off for us, and we hope that we're going to have many more of these here. We don't have a sound system. He didn't think we need one. I know how loud I can talk. I know how loud some of their friends can talk. Is Catherine still back there? Okay. And we think you'll be able to hear us, the acoustics here. We'd rather not have a sound system that gets overwhelming. That does mean you kind of need to pay attention and probably not do a lot of talking back and forth while we're going on up here. So with that, I am going to let y'all, Catherine,
right over here.
Let Catherine introduce these folks, and then we'll move on.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm the president of the Young Democrats. Thank you so much for coming. Our organization is open to anyone ages 14 to 40. We do have honorary Young at Heart membership for over 40. Yes. We just got our charter in December, so we're pretty new, kind of feeling out the waters. But we've got voter registration, vote by mail. I have some Amendment 4 information back there. If you hear something today that you want more information, it's on this table with the lamp over here. And I also have some half-cent sales tax flyers. That one is going to be on the primary ballot in August. And that's very important for our schools, for safety and technology funding. Yeah, we got ABC over here. Yes. Today, debating for us, we have Alyssa Pelham. She's our amazing secretary. And John Ferreira, he's our treasurer. They are awesome, and thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you. And I should mention, I forgot, that we do have registration cards up by the lamp for that gentleman's standing back there. Alvin again. You need to register to vote. You need to change your party affiliation. The deadline is August, July 30th, or the August 28th primary. So if you need to do that, we've got some cards up there, and these folks have some other information available.
My name is Tho Bishop. It's a weird first name. My mom is here, so if you have questions, please direct me to her. I'm the founder of the Bay County Young Republicans. We're a club still in the process of forming for a variety of reasons. I'm very happy to have Brent Anderson here, who is one of our founding members. He's been doing a lot of great campaign work for Amendment 4, which is a very important, Amendment 2, excuse me, Amendment 2, which is, I think, perhaps the most important constitutional amendment on the ballot. So if you have any questions, please go to him. We also have Ashton Norton here, who's trying to work on a teenage Republican club, which we're very excited about. But it's great to be here, and I look forward to discussing the issues.
And we are broadcasting live on our Facebook page and newsherald.com. So if you fall asleep and you want to see what get home, it'll still be there. So tonight we're going to start with the opening statements, and I made the grand decision that D comes before R in the alphabet. So we will let y'all introduce yourselves and
We're talking net neutrality or just?
No, just an opening statement on your party, the group
Yeah.
of Young Democrats.
Absolutely. Well, let's start. Democrats often get a bad name that we're trying to increase government, that we're the party of socialism, that we're trying to take over your lives. I think that today what we're going to try to present goes back to what at the heart is a very somewhat conservative idea, which is that the best way to solve a problem is the person who is closest and who will most effectively solve that problem. It's the old idea of subsidiarity, right? We have before us today 3 topics, which different attempts have been made to solve, but the problem lingers, things get dragged on, and in the end, there's a problem. And most of the time, it's the regular people who get shortchanged. And something needs to happen. So we're here today to represent practical solutions. Not necessarily abstract ideas, but more will show you, I think, that we're the party of solutions for the regular people. There needs to be some type of guardianship to defend our rights. And we believe that that's best taken with collective action, and that's what we hope to talk about today. So thank you.
I first want to start off by thanking Catherine for all the great work she's done in helping put this together. I also want to recognize again Daniel and Flexa for the wonderful work they're doing out there for us tonight. The reason why I thought it was important to hold an event like this is because I think, particularly in today's day and age, it is important to have political conversations moved away from social media and back to face-to-face. I think what we struggle with right now is a hyper-partisan environment where politics is no longer about finding ideas to solutions that trouble us, but instead becomes tribalism the same way that college football does. Now, as a Georgia Bulldog fan, I understand my hatred of the Florida Gators is irrational. This is not the proper way of governing the country. Now, what I look forward to tonight is that I think we're going to identify some similarities between us. I think at the end of the day, the issues being debated, we have common ground. We both want to have a free and open internet. We both want to make sure that we have a path to help convicted felons work their ways back into society. And we both want to have a way of having a healthcare system that provides the best quality service for all. But the reason why the Democratic Party has the reputation for being the side of bigger government is because all of these ideas being discussed today are about expanding the powers of the federal government. And so what I look forward to doing tonight is talk about how the market and how true local governments can bring about solutions far better than we're ever going to get from the bureaucracies in D.C. Thank you very much.
So tonight we're going to start with net neutrality. I've got a very basic definition of it that I'll read quickly here. Net neutrality is the idea that all internet use is created equal. The framework of rules used by the FCC meant to protect consumers and to enforce that equality and manage internet providers. The FCC is in the process of repealing net neutrality and giving providers more say in how they manage and prioritize their bandwidth, opening the doors for people to pay more for faster, better access. That's just a kind of a bland definition of it. We'll start over here since we just finished there, but the first question, how do you think that net neutrality has either positively or negatively impacted internet providers and users? And should the government protect consumers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the best case for that standard was the Trump administration suing the...
Stand up so we can hear you.
I think that the best case for that can be made by the Trump administration's Department of Justice, which sued to block the merger between AT&T and Time Warner. I was reading that case brief. The arguments made by the administration are that if these companies continue to get bigger, continue to expand, it's going to hurt competition, and it's going to hurt consumers at the end of the day. So don't take the Democrats' word for it. Use the Trump administration's Department of Justice. They sued because the issue has become that since the 1984 breakup of the Bell monopoly, these companies have slowly reconsolidated. They've become bigger and bigger and bigger. And so now you have 3 companies that have an enormous comparative advantage to everybody else in the market. And just the fact they were able to repeal the net neutrality rules by lobbying the Republican Party shows the amount of power that they have. Because at the end of the day, they don't care about what the consumers are going to go for, because all they're worried about is lining their pockets for more profit.
How's that camera frame? Okay. Well, actually, this is great because we are agree, I think, with just about everything here.
They can't hear you.
The problem is the definition laid out there ignores the entire issue, which is that net neutrality is not just a vague concept of an open internet. Net neutrality is Title II legislation. Now, for those that aren't familiar with it, that's FDR-era regulation of the telecommunications industry. Does anyone here think that the rules that applied at a time where radio was the leading way of getting information should apply to the internet? Absolutely not. Now, things too, we saw massive innovation and growth and freedom within the internet sphere without these ever in place. What we're talking about actually is Trump going back to the Bill Clinton era for freedoms of the internet that help promote diversity, that help promote innovation, help promote freedom of the web. Now, what's important to also understand is that repealing net neutrality is very important for the next generation of the internet. That's 5G internet access. Now, key to 5G is being able to create custom programs for consumers. Now, does anyone here really think that the data that goes into a heart monitor being witnessed over the internet should be treated equally to cat videos? I'm sorry, I don't. Does anyone think that financial data being sent across the web should be treated equally to Tumblr? I don't. I think that we should be able to have consumers and businesses adapt to a changing internet so that we can better serve consumers' own preferences. The best example of violating net neutrality in recent history was not blocking off or throttling competing internet sites. It was when TNT Mobile started offering free streaming services to Hulu and Netflix as a way of getting people to take their services. That was a service provider offering consumers the ability to get video streaming at an advantage over other websites. Who won from that? Consumers, who got that at a cheaper price. Now, the issue of competing internet companies, absolutely important. Nobody wants to be on the same side as Comcast. The problem is that what you actually saw with net neutrality was decreasing levels of investment in fiber infrastructure. And so the biggest winners of net neutrality was, in fact, the big ISPs. Now, the reason why they supported getting rid of it is because they can make more money with a bigger pie with the innovations net neutrality and getting rid of Title II can provide. But just like Wall Street benefited from Dodd-Frank and too big to fail is bigger than ever, this is the same sort of regulatory capture that would rewarded the Comcast of the country and prevented the growth of new startups in infrastructure.
Let me just kind of get myself together, but you mentioned that net neutrality prevents investments in the internet. Net neutrality is a new idea. In 2015, that's when net neutrality came around, correct? So from 1984 to 2015, internet service providers had plenty of opportunities to grow, to invest, to become the best in the world, right? Well, here's the thing. We're 28th in the world. The United States had 31 years to become the best without net neutrality regulations, and we are 28th in the world. Do you want to know who's number one? South Korea. South Korea has an ironclad net neutrality policy. They actually they've set up regulations where rural communities have to have a minimum internet, or internet providers had to provide a minimum internet speed. They provided internet service providers low interest loans so that they could actually expand. I think we all are for the free market, really. But what we have right now does not encourage a free market. What we have right now is we've got three main companies who have become a cartel. They had plenty of opportunities to grow for 31 years, and they didn't. They're not the best. South Korea, a country that regulates their internet service providers, is the best. And they also offer service at a much lower rate. I think it's a little over $30 a month for high-speed internet. In the US, we're paying how much? How much are you guys paying a month for wireless service? Over
$60.
$60, right? Okay, now you can say it's all about, the fact is, yes, South Korea is dense. It's easier for them to put up a tower, provide more service. But here's the thing, Canada, who's as big as the United States, probably more rural, their average service costs $52. So I'd say we need some regulation. Regulation is proven to help consumers.
No, go to Tho for a quick response.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up South Korea, because what South Korea did is nothing like Title II regulation. Now, they do have regulation, but the conversation is not about regulation in an abstract term. Now, if the Democratic Party actually wanted to provide a real answer, a real government solution here, they'd be talking about last mile connections that would require infrastructure to be shared amongst competitors, right? But that's not what net neutrality is. So if you want to do the South Korean plan, great. That's not what Title II connections do. Now, it is correct, we do suffer from a major cartel. But the problems there doesn't come from federal regulation. It comes from state and local regulation. The biggest issue that comes with new investments being made in the sphere actually comes from the simple fact that laying down fiber in that infrastructure is massively bundled by local governments that help give kickbacks to Comcast. If you want to create a very easy, localized solution to the issue of more internet competition, then let's require changes to the way the fiber is laid out to make it easier for new lines to be placed. Because that's the biggest thing that's holding up new investment. And that's exactly what Ajit Pai, who I very rarely say good things about people in Washington, D.C., this guy is perhaps the most heroic bureaucrat in Washington. Because he's suffered from threats of violence from not only himself but his family, because he stood up for an issue where most of the people passionate about it do not understand what is actually being involved. And so this is exactly what he wants his FCC to do, to bring greater competition around the country, to bring investment to rural countries that are being underserved, and to actually increase the amount of competition and let the free market work.
That's actually getting into one of the other questions. It wasn't as much of a cutoff as save it because you're going to need it. Because the next question is, for both sides, can you point to either something positive or negative, depending on how you feel, that's actually happened because of net neutrality being in place? And then, how do you think loosening regulations would affect the market and the consumers? So what has come out of it, good or bad, since it's been in place? And if it is loosened, what do you think will happen? Good or bad? I'll let Tho go first. Okay.
Well, the good thing is it wasn't in place very long. But again, we already saw a negative impact from it being put in place. We saw massive declines in investment at a time when we desperately needed it. You had major companies not investing in 5G internet services at a time where China is making major investments in those roads. So as far as what good can come, the biggest threat is that, a website of a Comcast, they're an easy person to beat up on. Again, I don't like being on the same side of as the issue as they are. But let's say they want to make it difficult for Hulu to stream on their website, on their services, right? Because they're Comcast, they're in the TV business, yada yada. Well, the great thing is that even without Title II, you still have the FTC that can settle the case. That is an anti-trade violation of the federal government. And you actually saw this happen in pre-Title II environment, where Comcast was actually hurt by BitTorrent. There's an issue there with the case about jurisdiction of FCC, FTC, but whatever. And you actually saw this with another company where a telephone provider that was also providing internet service started phasing out companies like Skype and things like that that were competing there. And that was actually struck down full out. So even the best case scenario, the problems that Title II was intended to fix never existed because the infrastructure was already there in place.
Thank you, Tho.
And that's right. And the infrastructure is already in place. I would just caution about using the causation here of net neutrality caused them to lower their investment. Again, net neutrality was only in place for 3 years. You have to remember that they had an interest in showing people, hey, look, our investment's coming down. Again, Comcast, Verizon, and AT&T have proven again and again that they are companies that can't necessarily be trusted with a service that is essential. I think it goes back to what we're talking about here, is that the internet today is essential for you to carry out business, for you to apply for a job, for you to do your banking. Like I said, for heart monitors that are being monitored through the internet for doctors, and that's only going to continue to expand. I think that may be a compromise point, which is that we don't necessarily have to treat all that internet traffic together, but especially for first responders, for example, right? But I still think that the issue here is that they're trying to get deeper into the pocket of the consumers, of small businesses, of internet startups. Again, right, you could have a company that is lobbying heavily for one political position, who can then throttle websites that try to avoid you from seeing those things. And all the studies show that if you click on a video, right, if you try to open a website, if that website doesn't load within a certain amount of time, you're probably going to move on to the next thing, right? So they are aware of that. They have an agenda to carry out. That's why we can't necessarily trust them. So now they come around and say, well, if you let us do our thing, we'll invest again, right? But they've had time. These rules were only in place for 3 years before they got overturned.
Quick response? Though you look like you had something to say.
No, I mean, he's correct, right? You can't necessarily take away, okay, decrease investment. I have no problem seeing that point. The good thing is that as long as we can agree that not all data really is equal, then the issue of Title II goes away. And then it's a question of what other solutions to be found. That's perfectly fine. To the other point, though, the real issue is not what the internet looks like today. Okay? It's what the internet's going to look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And if we had put in place FDR-era regulations, we would have constrained the internet, held back U.S. innovation, and we would have been much better, worse off for it. You know, there's another reason why Donald Trump is the best president since Calvin Coolidge.
All right. So, with that, all right, hey now. As long as that's a good name, it's okay. I see people smiling and laughing, so that's good. So, through that, what have y'all heard each other say that you can agree on? Because I heard some agreement when it comes to there being some sort of regulation needed. The internet is.
Can't hear you.
What? Can't hear you. Oh, sorry. Alvin can't hear me.
Alvin can't hear me.
So now we're going to ask them, based on what they have just said, what they feel like they have in common. One of the things I heard was there seems to be some agreement that it has to be some sort of regulation. There has to be some sort of, there's many things government's involved in that we are tired of government being involved in, no matter which party you're in. And it's hard sometimes to decide where do we want government in our lives. We say we don't want them, you know, and then you fall out from a heart attack and you want that ambulance to be there that's subsidized by the county. So, you know, it works both ways. But what have y'all, based on what you've said, what common ground do you see that could be done on net neutrality that would benefit everyone that you both sides would agree on?
Well, I think we do need to look more towards the South Korean.
You better stand up.
I think we do need to look more towards the South Korean model. I think there needs to be some regulations in place because let's face it, our rural communities need to have access to internet. I think that we need to realize that internet services is like a utility and it has to have some type of regulation. We can't let these big companies continue to consolidate and run amok. I think we can probably agree on that. And that we need to find ways with government intervention to increase business competitiveness so that the consumers actually benefit from the regulation.
Again, I think the biggest point of agreement, for one, I think we actually have agreed on that treating cat videos and financial data and hard technology is not the same, right? So then, great, Title II is not a good idea. We also agree on the importance of breaking up competition. And I think that's very vital. And so let's look at ways of breaking up Comcast to help increase investment here. There's a few good things there locally. Now the biggest issue with the South Korean model is that it's great when you're a small country like South Korea, right? But the United States is based on the size of Europe, okay? It's not quite the same. And so we have to admit that some solutions that work for highly condensed areas, right, are not the same things that are going to work for Montana. So if we can create a localized model with the understanding that the primary goal is not pushing a specific regulatory path, but instead bringing competition and a better marketplace for all Americans, we're going to all do better off. And it is important to have placement on the block to crack down on bad actors if they do start utilizing their market advantage to restricting and breaking their contract really with consumers.
Let's say it.
Yeah, and I think it's important, again, we can have, we agree, when we discuss this, an exemption for medical and for first responders. Because, again, but everything else, right, and again, we're talking about bad actors and anti-competitive behavior. right? We talked about the, my friend is going to talk about the market solution. The market is being manipulated by these large companies, right? And at the end of the day, we're all the ones who are getting hurt by it. So there has to be some type of control. Again, we agree with the exemptions for medical and first responders, but the rest of it should be treated fairly and equally, because or else other people will be at an advantage economically, and again, with your First Amendment. Don't forget that this is the thing. It is an essential service today. I run a local business here. I've been to local businesses where the computer goes down, you can't do anything. Right? This is an essential thing. You don't want them to have you with a chokehold to where they can control your business. Right? This is all essential services that need to happen.
All right, thank you. All right, very nice. On the first question. The second topic tonight is Constitutional Amendment 4, coming up on the Florida ballot. And this would restore voting rights to Floridians with felony convictions after they have completed their sentence, except those convicted of murder or a felony sexual offense. This has been a hot topic for years. It's one I like to hear discussed here locally. We seem to have a lot of people per capita going to jail compared to some other areas, and it costs a lot of people the ability not just to hunt, like I might like to do, but to actually vote and be a part of things. So we're going to start over here this time. Should I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Okay. So the question is, why should Floridians support or oppose this constitutional amendment, and what should they consider when voting?
There is a lot with the intent of this amendment that I fully agree with. The system we have now is far too punitive for former felons. I think particularly in respect to nonviolent criminals, right? And I think the bigger issue there is to address the laws to help de-felonize the state in the first place, right? The problem is that this amendment is, I think, in my opinion, too broad. Right? According to this amendment, Michael Vick would have the ability to vote again. So there's nothing there for animal cruelty. There's nothing there for manslaughter. There's nothing there for aggregated assault. It's in my opinion, it's too broad. Now again, is the intent of providing a pathway for felons to have their voting rights back a just cause? Absolutely. In fact, I'd go further. I think we should have the ability to restore gun rights to nonviolent felons as well. Let's restore all rights to those that have done their time and paid their dues. But simply giving voting rights in this very broad manner, to me, is going to face some unintended consequences. Now, the governor's solution of the 5-year waiting period and you still go through, I don't think that's a good solution either. I think there is area for compromise in the middle. But again, I think this amendment, as it is written, is too broad, and so I'll be voting no on it.
Thanks, and real quick, part of what I do is like admitting when you don't know something. If somebody over here could check, I think that manslaughter would fall under the murder statute because it's a lesser included charge of murder. So I believe like DUI manslaughter, second-degree murder, third-degree murder, felony murder would fall into that same thing, but I don't know that for sure. So I
Yes,
can
it
check.
does.
Thank you.
Nonviolent offenders.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad that we're in agreement. This is great. This is what this is all about. I'm going to start off with the point that Americans fought a revolution over taxation without representation, right? And what we have created in the state of Florida is a class of citizens who are forced to pay taxes, are forced to participate in every other civil action in life, but they're not allowed to vote. Half of these felons committed crimes when they're in their 20s, right? And again, and half of the present population in Florida prisons are nonviolent and non-sexual felony offenses, right? So these are not the people who are in the fringes of society. They've joined society. So you can have somebody, again, who's part and expected to do everything else as a citizen, but they're not allowed to give back their right to vote. And when you get back your right to vote, you're allowed again to sit for a jury, and again, you're allowed to have your gun rights restored in the state of Florida. Might be some disagreement about the scope of this statute. From the way that I understand it, right, it will be after someone has gone through parole and has gone through probation, right? So this is not just automatically they walk out of prison, they have it back, right? So this will kick it back to the folks, the probation officers, and to the parole boards who can decide these things when they're released, right? So it's not just they're going to come back and they're going to go vote, right? So this is again important. We have a class, this is 10% of the eligible voters of Florida, right? We're talking about 1.5 million people who live in the state of Florida who are being denied the right to run for office and to decide on the legislation that affects them.
And I will add, if quite an arduous process to get your voting rights back if you're convicted of a felony in Florida, and I believe we're one of 4 states left that still does this. The way we do it, you have to go before the governor's cabinet.
That says a lot right there.
I wanted to ask it's kind of what you were saying. We're already covering murder and we're covering these serious crimes. Are there other ones that you think should be considered to fall into that category? And something you said struck me that, Michael Vick would be able to vote again. But I'll pose a question, why shouldn't Michael Vick be allowed to vote again if he served a sentence and done his time?
In my opinion, I think giving the right, a political right to vote to someone that has demonstrated explicitly anti-social proclivities doesn't benefit the electoral process at all. If you have a demonstrated record in a court of law of committing acts that are beyond the pale, I mean, in this case, electrifying, drowning dog, I mean, read that for what it's worth. I don't see any benefit to the Florida government in providing someone that has demonstrated those actions the right to vote. Now again, are there a lot of people misserved by the criminal justice system as we have today? Absolutely. And if the constitutional amendment does really only apply to non-criminal offenders or non-violent offenders, then again I have an issue with the way that all the summaries that I've seen in researching this have been written, because it simplifies it as murder and sexual assault. And so there we have an issue there with the selling of that, with potentially confusing language. Let's make it for non-violent criminals. And then let's go further than that and find ways to reduce the amount of laws that create non-violent criminals in the first place. Because that's the real issue here. It's not voting rights. It's the over-criminalization of people in America and Florida as well.
Amen to that, brother.
The only antisocial behavior that's been proven in court has been Rick Scott's clemency board. But we have to understand the way that this process works today, right? So today you have a clemency board that in 2011 approved only 0.5% of the felons who requested their voting rights back, right? This is an unelected board with no judicial review, and a federal court found it that, what was the exact quote? That it was arbitrary, subjective, and discriminatory, found in federal court. The federal judge sent it back to Rick Scott and to Pam Bondi that they're required by law to change the system. Right? This goes back again to a practical solution to something that our governor hasn't done. Right? And so the citizens took it upon themselves to get this done. Right? And so that's the only antisocial behavior here, has been the fact that Florida continues to just kick these citizens down and to not give them a way to reintegrate into society. Right? There are studies that show that when you reintegrate these felons back inside and giving them the right to vote, they're less likely to commit crimes again. Right? And in Florida, with a rate of only 25%, you can significantly reduce our recidivism rate if you get these people integrated back into society as full citizens.
On that one, mostly what I heard, y'all are basically in agreement. What do y'all think should be done? How should that be handled that y'all can agree on? Is there some gray areas? What do y'all absolutely agree on that needs to be done?
So I think the only disagreement there is language. I have no interest in defending Rick Scott. I certainly have no interest in defending Pam Bondi. And so I think this is something that, and I think it's exciting to have a new generation of Republicans who have really been leading the fight in criminal justice reform around the country. And so again, I think this is one issue where a changing of generations should pay off in a major, major way in some real reforms that will help a lot of lives.
Well, I would say that I'm not sure about this, but he brings up a good case about what crimes, the discussion was brought up, before, about maybe we should include these things in sentencing law, right? Where if we decide that a crime, as citizens, through the rule of law, through due process, is so heinous that these people should be stricken from the voting rolls, then let's make that a part of the law, right? Instead of just creating this general and arbitrary rule that we've been going through, where again the governor comes in and he can change the rules and we don't have any response. So
yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely.
We've got a solution.
An interesting part of that is, you know, all of this happens in a courtroom where most people hopefully never are having to deal with felony charges. But what it all comes down to, it's not really the trial, it's not really the, you know, what you saw. What happens is the judge hears everything, whether it's a plea agreement or a sentencing, and there's this little thing he has to decide. Does he withhold adjudication of guilt or not? If the judge withholds adjudication of guilt, you are not a convicted felon. If you can check on your employment box, have you ever been convicted of a felony? No. You can have two people found guilty by a jury of the exact same charge. Maybe one of them has a better attorney, maybe one of them has more money to spend. But who knows? But one judge says, I adjudicate you guilty, the other judge says, I withhold adjudication, and it's the exact same charge, exact same offense, but one of them has lost their voting rights. So, and then handling that in sentencing would be a...
And I do think that, you know, I mean, if you look, these laws, they generally, I hate to say discriminate, but they really do. They discriminate against the poor, the people who don't have money to defend themselves. You know, and we can't say that all justice is blind because we've seen it. We've seen, you know, issues where two men convicted of the same crime with the same background, in Okaloosa even, got completely different sentences. You know, we've seen it with rapists. A white rapist and a black rapist. Same crime, same background, totally different sentencing. So we have to admit here that the way that we are doing things here in Florida, we are definitely disenfranchising a portion of the population, and it tends to be the poor, and it tends to be people who we know that should have a voice, and we're taking away their voice.
There's also a low percentage of people who actually apply have their rights restored because it's such a pain in the rear that they don't even want to, you almost need an attorney to go through that. So there's a lot of agreement on that. All right, our last topic, excuse me, is Medicaid expansion. We can probably run through that in about 3 minutes, huh? Basically, it would open up Medicaid eligibility in Florida, and Governor Rick Scott is opting out of that. It was part of the whole ACA. Now that's all back up in the air again with the new president, but it's y'all's turn to go first. Where do y'all stand on Florida Medicaid?
Well, we stand with nearly 70% of Floridians who are in support of expanding Medicaid. You know, if you look at all the 34 states now that have expanded Medicaid, overwhelmingly they've seen a positive impact. They've seen access to care increase. They've seen, actually they've seen increased revenue because expanding Medicaid has increased jobs. You know, the more people who can have access to regular doctors, that means that there's going to be more doctors, physicians, you know, doctors, nurses, clerks that are needed. We also looked at, it actually helps with the reduction of uncompensated care costs. So in case you're wondering what that is, you know, when somebody goes into a hospital and they don't have insurance, they go into the emergency room. That one person costs a hospital $900 per year. One uninsured person costs a hospital $900 per year. We've got 660,000 uninsured people here in Florida. You multiply that up, that's a lot of money that our hospitals are losing. If you look at Michigan reduced by expanding Medicaid, Michigan reduced their uncompensated care costs by 50%. They increased access to health so that people who have diabetes and heart disease and all these issues that can actually be maintained if they could see their routine doctor, they could see a routine doctor and could manage, you know, and can afford their prescription drugs, they wouldn't be using emergency care rooms or hospitals as their primary care provider, and therefore bringing up the cost. You know, the other thing that I just want to point out is that, you know, one uninsured person, I know we talk about, and I'm sure that, you know, though you might bring it up, is that, you know, maybe this encourages people to kind of just sit and be lazy and not, you know, not go out and do for their own. 2/3 of the people who this expansion would cover actually work. They do work. And what they found is that they are a lot more financially stable. You know, if I were to walk in, if I had no insurance, and I were to walk into a hospital today, my chances of filing for bankruptcy increases by Like it doubles. So I think, you know, we have to think about, there's a cost, but the fact of the matter is, it's U.S. tax dollars, right? It's our tax dollars that are going to be paying for it, because the federal government's taking care of 90% of this cost to expand. Actually, I think it's 100% in 2020, I think it's supposed to be done. So 90% of this cost is federal tax dollars. Look, we're all paying it, right? We're all paying tax dollars, and do you think any of that's coming back to our state right now? No. It's going to the 34 states that have expanded Medicaid. So that's why I'd say we're in support of the Medicaid expansion, and again, we're with 70% of the Floridians who do want to expand it.
Well, I'm glad she brought up the cost, because right now Medicaid is already 30% of the Florida budget, over 30%. Okay, it's the largest expenditure in the budget. If you increase the amount of Medicaid recipients, that number is going to go up. Now, she is correct. A lot of this money is coming from the federal government. But we suffer from a federal government that has a massive spending problem, especially on the entitlement side, that no one is addressing. We have Social Security costs going way, way up. We have Medicare, we have Medicaid. These are problems that are going to haunt, perhaps not in the next 4 or 5 years, but for your children and your grandchildren. We are setting up a debt problem right then and there before we get the issues within Florida itself. Now, she brought up, there's actually, it's an interesting thing, studies on Medicaid performance. The problem is that we've only gone through a few years, right, with expansion since Obamacare. The most interesting study is actually Oregon, because Oregon actually expanded Medicare Medicaid before anyone else did. In 2008, they did a lottery system for people that ended up resembling the Obamacare expansion class. What we saw there was a massive increase, actually, in ER visits. We saw a massive increase in medical use. We saw no massive gains in health results. Now, the problem, I think, with the conversation when we talk about Medicare, healthcare in this country, is that we focus on the insurance side and not the service side. One of the biggest problems with Medicaid is that it's very difficult to find a doctor that actually accepts it. You only get 60 cents as a doctor. You only get 60 cents on the dollar for reimbursements. And actually, one of the issues, she talked about the jobs created by medical clerks. Well, the cost of administration and complying with the government bureaucracy is a major driver of the healthcare costs in this country. And so those actually are not jobs producing anything of value. They're simply people repeating paperwork so that doctors can get paid. You actually have another issue there, because the increased emphasis on coding through federal regulation actually decreases the quality of direct care between a doctor and a patient. The best solution is not by simply creating and expanding a federal bureaucracy for an insurance plan that you may or not be able to use the doctor of your choice. It is how do we address the supply side of healthcare? How do we attract more doctors? How do we attract more nurses? How do we attract more medical personnel? How do we make prescription drugs cheaper? How do we make everything that happens, actually receiving medical care, cheaper? Luckily, the Florida State House has actually taken some wonderful steps in that regard, increasing the powers that medical practitioners have, right? So that increases the number of people that actually see patients. One of the things I think we should see is decreasing on a federal level licensing, which we have Venezuelan doctors who are scrubbing toilets in Orlando. Let's get them here, let's give them a refresher course with the unique aspects of American healthcare, and let's actually put them to work rather than keeping people with trained skills that we vitally need out on the sidelines. So again, the issue here should be, how do we find ways to increase the number of healthcare professionals? How do we make the actual cost of healthcare cheaper, rather than just papering it over with another insolvent federal bureaucracy? Because again, that check is eventually going to come. This is not healthcare for free.
Okay, so part of the reason we're talking about this, there's a coverage gap in Florida. I think there's about 800,000 people who currently don't have coverage and would qualify if this was in place. It brought it into the state, and I believe it's about 140% of the poverty level, which for a family of four is about a little bit under $35,000. Think about a family of four being under that amount. So the question is, how do we bridge that gap, if not this way?
Well, the biggest issue we have is that, again, the American, and look, I'm not defending the American system of healthcare, because right now what we have is this really bad era of moral hazard, where the greatest payments are not from patient with doctor. It's having this third-party insurance-driven model. That's what blows costs. Another great relic of the FDR era. So how do we address that? Well, again, I can speak from personal experience. For most of my life, I did not have medical health care. My mom didn't have health insurance. So what happened is that when we got sick, we went to the doc in a box, right? Now what we need is a movement away towards more direct primary care, going back to the good old model of you know your doctor, right? And then combine that with catastrophic costs, which right now you can get through the Obamacare models, which impacts the prices there too, actually drives it up compared to what was there before. That costs about $189 on national average for catastrophic coverage. Well, that, a little over $2,000, right? Well, the average Medicaid recipient receives over $5,000 in benefits. So let's go with a model where you have catastrophic coverage, so that way if something truly terrible happens to you, you have this that's why that's there, right? To cover if you have cancer, if you get hit by a bus, right? Then combine it with a health savings account that you can actually be put in place with the doctor you're choosing. Let that roll over as well. Because the original purpose of Medicaid was really to address children. And so allow that to accumulate over time, and that actually provides a solid real safety net without creating all this price, screwing up the price systems of American healthcare. And that actually gets us something closer to a market model, and will benefit not just those on Medicaid itself, but will help our medical community as well as patients throughout the country, because we're getting away from this broken insurance-first model.
Amen to that, Robert.
What my friend is doing, and we're in agreement with a lot of it, but we're not talking about the actual topic of Medicaid expansion, right? So we're not arguing this specifically on the merits here of what was being discussed. What happened was our governor created a problem where, again, you have people who make a little bit of money or do Medicaid. People who make over $40,000, I have a subsidy under the Affordable Care Act. Then there's people in the middle who are lost, right? So we talk about how do we expand the healthcare system? Well, you let more people have insurance so that they can go see a doctor. Because those people without insurance are not going to see a doctor. How are you going to get to know your doctor? You're going to get to know your doctor by having insurance and being able to go to the doctor, right? These people are trapped in the middle, right? You're talking about a family of 3 that makes $26,000 a year, right? These are not people who are living high. These are people who need our assistance to get to the doctor because they're likely to declare bankruptcy if they do get hit by a bus, right? And that's the the safety net of what's going on here. This was a problem that was created when our governor decided not to expand Medicaid, right? And these are payroll taxes that all of us in this room are paying for. So this goes back to, again, let's solve this problem with a practical solution. I understand that, sure, we need to go look at other things in the healthcare system. But let's come back to this topic here at hand, which is that healthcare is incredibly resistant to the market reforms that have been tried in the past, right? Healthcare is not a regular marketplace, right? It's by its nature uncompetitive. And the best example to this is always if your doctor tells you that you need to have a bypass, you're not going to go home and send it out for bid, right? Let's go out and I'm going to call 4 doctors and I'm going to ask, okay, what's your price on a bypass? No, you're going to get yourself to the hospital. You're going to go get a bypass. When you're in the hospital, you don't have choice like we do in a free market system. The healthcare system doesn't respond in the same way that other things respond to the free market. Listen, I'm all for a free market. I'm all for business. But this is a special case. There's always going to be a gap of information when you talk about your patient and your doctor, right? When you go to a technician at the hospital to get some tests done, you're not reviewing and looking and saying, well, this isn't the best machine. There's actually a better one out right now. You don't know these things, right? So it creates an issue of equality of information, which a free market needs in order for you to set the price, right? So when you talk about expanding care, you need to have this Medicaid expansion in order, again, to get people into the system, right? Because healthcare doesn't respond in the way that my friend thinks it will to just supply side and free market reform. And that's
It kind of bleeds over, forgive me, to the next question. Does expanding Medicaid, that we kind of just talked about that a bit, does it address the issues that are at the core of healthcare access in Florida? Does expanding that take care of,
And the answer is no. Okay, Rick Scott did not create these problems. Okay, and I'm not going to follow the partisan route. It wasn't Obama. This has been a bipartisan issue for decades. We've had 100 years of government mismanagement of healthcare, and the result was a runaway system of prices. Now, look, the American healthcare system is actually very strong compared to the rest of the world. Cancer rates, cancer mortality rates, much lower here than in Europe. We have a lot to be proud of as far as what market movement has been allowed to exist. This rejection of outright socialized medicine has actually increased the health benefits of Americans. So that is a positive. But the problem of rising costs was not a Rick Scott issue. The core of this is exactly what I talked about earlier. It's getting that moral hazard of having the insurance companies being the primary payment process for most of the patients. So again, how do we solve that? That has to be the step number one, because anything that doesn't address that core fundamental perversion of the American healthcare system is just papering it over. And so again, how do we solve that? My friend here talked about how nobody actually looks on the marketplace to find the most affordable ways of getting medical services. That's simply not true. Simply not true. You have Oklahoma Surgery Center that can give you a hip replacement for far less than Kaz got it from here at the hospital. And they advertise those prices. Simply allowing doctors to publicize their prices do wonders for consumer knowledge. Right then there. Now in the case of you're suffering a heart attack and you're going to the ER, I'm not saying that you're going to then go shop around to your favorite doc in the box. That's not the issue there. You go to the hospital. I'm not against the idea that hospitals shouldn't reject people in immediate need, right? That's a second kind of code. But as far as addressing the actual costs, the actual causes for what makes American healthcare so unaffordable, it's not a lack of Medicaid. It's not a lack of government entitlements. It's a lack of a true market system and a true pricing system that hurts both doctors and patients. But it's great for insurance companies.
Well, I just want to ask, I know you said that there is a competitive, pricing. I just want to know, out of a show of hands, how many of you have actually really picked up, when you had an issue, how many of you have gone around and shopped around and said, look, do I want to stay here or do I want to go to Kentucky? Honestly.
Depends on the issue.
How many people have insurance? If you don't have insurance, it's an issue. So
my
other
question is that the people that are in this gap, they might not have access. They might not have access to looking at those numbers. I'm not going to say that this is going to cure everything. It's not. I think we can all agree that Medicaid expansion isn't going to cure every wrong that's in the system right now. But the fact is that something has to happen, right? And we know that we can't really rely on government or our legislative authorities now to fix it. So we've got to do something, because we've got people who are dying, we've got people who are without care, we've got people who are losing everything because they have an emergency and they can't afford it. And you know what? It's causing more issues because we've got to turn around and we've got to support them after that. So my opinion is no, Medicaid expansion doesn't solve everything, but at least it's a step in the right direction, and it's better than nothing right now.
Two points there. One, we can trust our legislators because we have taken. I ran for office in 2014. One of my primary issues was how to deregulate the health provider market. Okay, most of what I ran has already been done. Okay, so the Republican Florida House has actually been very bold in stripping regulation and has actually made Florida one of the most innovative states in the country for medical care. So we actually can trust in the legislation in Florida for that. The other case, in terms of actual people dying on the streets, interestingly enough, I'm not claiming causation is correlation here. But if you actually look at the data of the last 2 years, mortality rates went up in states that increased, that expanded Medicaid. They did not increase for those that did not.
All right.
So that's going on
This is an interesting one because I'd like to know where else we find common ground on this. It may not be as broad as the first two, but
Well, I think we find common ground in the fact that the problem, I agree, is the way that the insurance markets run our healthcare system. We're not in disagreement with the fact that the price of medical care in America is inflated by our healthcare providers and by the insurance companies, right? We're in agreement there. And the disagreement comes back to this is not going to solve all of the things, but it's still something, right? Just because it doesn't solve all of the problems doesn't mean we can reject it, which actually makes the problem worse. It's a very difficult argument, I think, practically to follow. But I think our agreement is correct. Things need to be done with insurance reforms because, again, there's not. We have the worst of both worlds right now in our healthcare system, where it's not a competitive free market system. Yet we just give Medicare to people who are 65 and above because we think that's a good system. we have the worst of both, because we've tried to compromise our way because no one has the political courage to actually either say, okay, let's make it a competitive insurance market, or let's just give Medicare for all, right? So that's part of the issue.
And I agree with that. I think that we agree on the matters of insurance. I think where we disagree, the biggest disagreement is that I am far more concerned about the long-term entitlement cost of Medicaid and other programs and the solvency there, and the long-term consequences. Fair, I mean, because if it wasn't for that, if I wasn't concerned that eventually we're going to have to pay this all back, then I'd have no problem having a Medicaid public option. I'm just afraid that the costs of this program in the long run are going to end up being far more detrimental than benefits in the short term.
And I think that today, you're the only Republican
Yes.
who is concerned about it.
Unfortunately so.
On that note, I'll show you all how to get hands raised. Who out there has ever had to be on the phone with their insurance company because of a snafu or a call? So that, I think both sides make a good point when they say that's probably what needs to be looked at first. So we've gotten through the three major issues. We wanted to take questions from the audience. Aaron? Oh my goodness.
We can take that if you want to ask a question.
Okay.
Hashtag debate bay. Want to read
I'll just read this out loud. The Democratic leadership has telegraphed that if they regain power, they will increase taxes and reinstate many regulations. Why is that good for America, and should individuals have more control over what they do with their money? Who wants to take that one first? I'll do it. Volunteer.
Yeah, in the spirit of this discussion, I think one thing to keep in mind when you're talking about the other side is that you should always attempt to take the best argument that the other side has and try to beat that argument, instead of getting the worst arguments from the other side and then just piling on and saying, well, this is what they hold, right? You know, he's offering good solutions to them. I respect his points. I'll argue with those, right? This is a very sort of general question of the Democrats are trying to take over power. Again, I go back to the point I made in the beginning. These are practical solutions that people with common sense will agree. We want a free and open internet, right? We want medical care access to people who make less than $25,000 a year with a family of three who need our assistance, right? We don't want to have second-class citizens in our state because that's unfair to the values of America, right? These are practical solutions. Sure, there's action, political action. Politics is not a dirty word, right? Even though it may feel like it's some way. Politics is the proper way that we manage our discourse and conflict in society. When we start saying politics is all bunk, well, then the only solution then is the rule of who's the strongest, right? Then you start slipping into authoritarian ideas. So our political action that we're suggesting here are practical solutions to the problems that we see. They're not attempts to entrap the individual. They're not attempts to limit your individual liberties. They're solutions.